In a bustling clinic, a doctor dismisses the quiet complaints of an elderly woman, telling her there's nothing wrong. He has no idea she's a corporate magnate in disguise. The very next morning, he watches in disbelief as she returns, not as a patient, but as a person with a different purpose entirely. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Margaret Thompson had been awake since 3 in the morning, her arthritic hands clutching the edge of her worn quilt as waves of pain coursed through her lower back. At 78, she had learned to distinguish between the everyday aches. That came with age and something more serious. This was definitely something more serious. The pain had started 3 weeks ago as a dull throb, easily dismissed as the result of too much gardening or perhaps sleeping in an awkward position, but it had grown steadily worse, radiating down her legs and making it difficult to walk more than a few steps without stopping to catch her breath. More concerning still were the dizzy spells and the persistent nausea that had begun accompanying the pain. Margaret lived alone in the small house she'd shared with her late husband Robert for 47 years. Their children, David and Sarah, lived on opposite coasts, both busy with their own families and careers. She rarely bothered them with her problems, preferring to maintain the independence she'd fought so hard to preserve since Robert's death 5 years earlier. But this morning was different. As she attempted to rise from bed, a sharp electric pain shot down her spine, causing her legs to buckle. She gripped the nightstand, knocking over the framed photograph of Robert in his Navy uniform. The glass cracked across his smiling face, and Margaret took it as a sign. Robert would have insisted she see a doctor immediately. The Westfield Medical Clinic was a 15-minute drive from her house, though the journey felt much longer as Margaret gripped the steering wheel of her ancient Honda Civic, pausing at every red light to breathe through another wave of pain. She'd been a patient at the clinic for over 20 years, back when old Dr. Peterson ran it with the warmth and attention that made patients feel like family rather than file numbers. Dr. Peterson had retired 2 years ago, selling the practice to a younger physician named Dr. James Mitchell. Margaret had met Dr. Mitchell only once before for a routine checkup that had felt rushed and impersonal. He'd spent more time looking at his computer screen than at her, asking rapid-fire questions, while typing notes and barely waiting for her answers. The waiting room at Westfield Medical was crowded despite the early hour. Margaret approached the reception desk, where a young woman with bright purple nail polish was filing papers while chewing gum loudly. "I need to see Dr. Mitchell," Margaret said, her voice strained with pain. "I've been having severe back pain for weeks, and it's getting worse." The receptionist, whose name tag read Brittany, didn't look up from her filing. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but this is urgent. I'm in considerable pain, and—" "We don't take walk-ins," Brittany interrupted, finally glancing up with an expression of mild annoyance. "The next available appointment is in 3 weeks. Margaret felt her heart sink. 3 weeks? But I've been coming to this clinic for over 20 years. Surely there must be something sooner?" "Look, lady," Brittany said, her voice taking on an edge of impatience, "everyone thinks their problem is urgent. If you're having a real emergency, you should go to the ER. Otherwise, you'll have to wait like everyone else." Margaret was about to respond when another patient, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, approached the desk. Brittany's demeanor immediately brightened. "Mr. Johnson!" "Right on time for your appointment. Dr. Mitchell will see you shortly." Margaret watched as Mr. Johnson was ushered to a private room while she remained standing at the desk, her pain making it difficult to remain upright. She tried once more. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not one to complain, but this pain is unlike anything I've experienced. Could you at least ask Dr. Mitchell if he might have a few minutes?" Brittany sighed dramatically and picked up the phone. Margaret could hear her speaking in a bored tone. "Dr. Mitchell? There's an old lady here without an appointment claiming she has back pain." "Yeah, I told her to go to the ER." Okay, I'll tell her. She hung up and looked at Margaret with barely concealed irritation. Dr. Mitchell says if it's a real emergency, the ER is equipped to handle it. We're a family practice, not an urgent care center. Your appointment is March 15th at 2 o'clock. Next. Margaret stood there for a moment, feeling smaller and more invisible than she had in years. The other patients in the waiting room avoided eye contact, some clearly uncomfortable with the exchange they'd witnessed. She slowly made her way to an empty chair and sat down, not trusting her legs to carry her back to the car just yet. As she sat there, Margaret observed the clinic with new eyes. The walls were lined with Dr. Mitchell's diplomas and awards, but the personal touches that had made Dr. Peterson's office feel warm and welcoming were gone. The magazines were old, the furniture was uncomfortable, and the staff moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had forgotten that their job was to care for human beings. She thought about Robert and how he would have handled this situation. He'd been a quiet man, but never one to back down when something was wrong. "Margaret," he used to say, "sometimes life tests us not with grand gestures, but with small moments that define who we really are." After sitting for 20 minutes, the pain became unbearable again. Margaret made her way slowly back to her car, each step a reminder of the help she'd been denied. She considered driving to the emergency room, but the thought of spending hours in another waiting room, surrounded by truly urgent cases, made her feel selfish for even considering it. Instead, she drove home and called her daughter Sarah in California. When the voicemail picked up, she almost hung up, but then decided to leave a message. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Mom. I'm having some back pain, and I tried to see the doctor today, but they can't fit me in for 3 weeks. I'm sure it's nothing serious. I just wanted to hear your voice. Love you." She spent the rest of the day in bed, alternating between ice packs and heating pads, trying to find a position that would offer even momentary relief from the constant throbbing. As evening approached, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. She was going to return to the clinic tomorrow and demand to be seen not as a favor, but as her right as a long-term patient and a human being in pain. What Margaret didn't know as she drifted into a restless sleep was that tomorrow would bring changes that would transform not only her own life, but the entire future of Westfield Medical Clinic. Sometimes the universe has a way of balancing scales that seem impossibly tilted, and Margaret Thompson was about to discover that even at 78, life still had some surprising cards left to play. Margaret woke the next morning with a renewed sense of determination despite the persistent pain that seemed to have worsened overnight. She dressed carefully in her best navy blue dress, the one Robert had always said brought out her eyes, and applied a touch of lipstick. If she was going to fight for proper medical care, she would do so with dignity. The drive to Westfield Medical seemed shorter this time, perhaps because her resolve had overtaken her anxiety. She arrived just as the clinic was opening and was surprised to see several cars already in the parking lot, including a sleek black BMW she didn't recognize. Inside, the waiting room was buzzing with unusual activity. Brittany was at her desk, but she was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone on the phone. Margaret noticed several people in business suits moving through the clinic, carrying clipboards and briefcases. She approached the reception desk once more, but this time Brittany was too distracted to be dismissive. "Mrs. Thompson?" Brittany said, looking up with surprise. "Oh, I'm not sure what's happening today. There are all these people here, and I'd like to see Dr. Mitchell," Margaret said firmly. "I was told to come back, and I'm here." Before Brittany could respond, a tall woman in an expensive gray suit approached them. She had silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Excuse me," the woman said to Margaret with a warm smile. "Are you a patient here?" "I've been trying to be," Margaret replied. "I'm Margaret Thompson. I've been coming to this clinic for over 20 years. The woman's expression grew more interested. I'm Victoria Walsh from Walsh & Associates. We're conducting an evaluation of the clinic. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your recent experience here?" Margaret glanced around the waiting room, noticing that other patients were being approached by similar professionals with clipboards. Something significant was clearly happening, though she couldn't quite understand what. "I suppose that would be fine," Margaret said, "though I should mention that my recent experience hasn't been particularly positive." Victoria Walsh's pen paused over her notepad. "Would you mind elaborating?" As Margaret began to recount yesterday's dismissive treatment, she noticed Dr. Mitchell emerge from his office. He looked harried and kept glancing nervously at the people in suits. When his eyes met Margaret's, there was a flicker of recognition followed quickly by what appeared to be concern. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Mitchell said, approaching them with a forced smile. "I understand you were here yesterday. I'm so sorry for any inconvenience." "Why don't we get you into an examination room right away?" Margaret was taken aback by the sudden change in his demeanor. Yesterday she couldn't even get him to take a phone call about her condition. Today he was personally escorting her to an examination room. "Dr. Mitchell," Victoria Walsh interjected smoothly, "I'll need to continue my conversation with Mrs. Thompson after you've finished. We're gathering comprehensive patient feedback as part of our assessment." Dr. Mitchell's face went pale. "Assessment?" "Yes. Doctor, didn't you receive the notification? The clinic's ownership situation is under review. We're evaluating all aspects of the practice, including patient satisfaction and care standards." Margaret watched this exchange with growing curiosity. She allowed Dr. Mitchell to guide her to an examination room, but his hands were visibly shaking as he helped her onto the table. "Now then, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice artificially cheerful, "tell me about this back pain you've been experiencing." For the next 30 minutes, Dr. Mitchell was everything he hadn't been the day before. He listened attentively, performed a thorough examination, ordered x-rays, and even scheduled an immediate appointment with an orthopedic specialist. His transformation was so complete that Margaret might have thought she was seeing a different person entirely. "I'm prescribing some pain medication to help you feel more comfortable," he said, scribbling on his prescription pad. "And I want you to know that if you experience any worsening of symptoms, you should call immediately, day or night." "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell," Margaret said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that his sudden attentiveness had more to do with the people in suits than with genuine concern for her well-being. When she emerged from the examination room, Victoria Walsh was waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a comfortable chair. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Thompson?" she asked with what seemed like genuine concern. "Better, I suppose," Margaret replied, "though I have to admit I'm confused by all of this." She gestured around the clinic. "Yesterday I couldn't even get an appointment, and today Dr. Mitchell is treating me like I'm his most important patient." Victoria nodded knowingly. "That's not uncommon when practices are undergoing ownership transitions. Tell me, have you been satisfied with your care at this clinic over the years?" Margaret thought carefully before responding. "Under Dr. Peterson, yes, he was wonderful, but since Dr. Mitchell took over—" She paused, not wanting to speak ill of anyone, but also unwilling to lie. "Let's just say that yesterday was particularly disappointing." "Would you mind if I recorded our conversation?" Victoria asked, producing a small digital recorder for accuracy in our report. Margaret agreed, and for the next hour, she found herself telling Victoria about her 20 years as a patient at the clinic. She spoke about Dr. Peterson's warm, personal care and the way the practice had changed under new management. She described yesterday's dismissive treatment and her growing sense that patients had become little more than revenue streams. "Mrs. Thompson," Victoria said when Margaret had finished, "you mentioned that you've been coming here for 20 years. Did you know Dr. Peterson well?" "Oh, yes," Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in days. "He delivered my grandchildren when they were born. He was at my husband's bedside during his final illness. He was more than a doctor. He was a friend." And you knew about his financial difficulties before he sold the practice? Margaret's smile faded. Financial difficulties? No, I thought he retired because he wanted to spend more time with his family. Victoria's expression became more serious. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Peterson was forced to sell because of mounting debts and some unfortunate investments. He sold to Dr. Mitchell for considerably less than the practice was worth because he needed immediate liquidity. This news hit Margaret like a physical blow. Dr. Peterson had been too proud to let his patients know he was struggling. He'd simply announced his retirement and wished them well with their new physician. The truth is, Victoria continued, Dr. Mitchell leveraged himself heavily to buy this practice, and he's been cutting corners ever since to maximize profits. Shorter appointments, less personal attention, minimal staff training, all in service of the bottom line. Margaret felt a surge of anger on behalf of Dr. Peterson and all the patients who had been treated as Margaret had been yesterday. What happens now? She asked. Victoria Walsh smiled, and for the first time, Margaret detected something almost mischievous in her expression. Well, Mrs. Thompson, that depends partly on patients like you. We're conducting this evaluation on behalf of a potential new owner who's very interested in returning this practice to its roots. Quality care, personal attention, and respect for every patient who walks through these doors. As Margaret left the clinic that day, prescription in hand and follow-up appointments scheduled, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been part of something larger than a simple medical visit. The people in suits were still there, and Dr. Mitchell looked increasingly worried as the day progressed. Whatever was happening at Westfield Medical, Margaret had a feeling that change was coming, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like change for the better. 2 days after her puzzling experience at the clinic, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. She was in her kitchen, carefully arranging flowers from her garden, a task that had become more challenging with her back pain, but remained one of her greatest pleasures. Mrs. Thompson, this is Victoria Walsh. We spoke at the clinic the other day. Margaret remembered the elegant woman with the clipboard quite clearly. Yes, of course. How can I help you? I was wondering if you might have some time to meet with me today. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you about the clinic and about Dr. Peterson. Would you be available for lunch? Curiosity overcoming caution, Margaret agreed to meet Victoria at Cedar Grove Cafe, a quaint restaurant in the town center that had been one of her and Robert's favorite spots. As she drove there, she couldn't help but wonder what this mysterious woman could possibly want to discuss. Victoria was already seated at a corner table when Margaret arrived, and she rose gracefully to greet her. In the natural light of the cafe, Margaret could see that Victoria was probably in her early 60s, with kind eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Thank you so much for coming," Victoria said as they settled into their seats. "How are you feeling? Has the pain improved at all?" "Somewhat," Margaret replied. "The medication Dr. Mitchell prescribed has helped, and I see the specialist next week, but I have to admit, I'm curious about why you wanted to meet." Victoria smiled and folded her hands on the table. "Margaret, may I call you Margaret? I want to be completely honest with you. I'm not just conducting a routine evaluation of the clinic." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Oh? I represent a client who has a very personal interest in Westfield Medical. Someone who was deeply affected by Dr. Peterson's forced retirement and who has been watching Dr. Mitchell's management of the practice with growing concern." "I see," Margaret said, though she didn't, really. "And this client prefers to remain anonymous?" "For now, yes. But I can tell you that this person has the resources to purchase the clinic and the desire to restore it to the standard of care that patients like you deserve." Margaret sipped her tea, processing this information. "Why are you telling me this?" Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Because my client specifically requested that I speak with long-term patients who knew Dr. Peterson well. Your testimony about the changes in care since Dr. Mitchell took over has been invaluable. But more than that, My client believes that patients like you should have a voice in what happens next. What do you mean? I mean that if my client purchases the clinic, they want to ensure that the new management reflects the values and standards that made Westfield Medical special under Dr. Peterson's leadership. They want patient advocates, people who understand what quality healthcare looks like from the receiving end. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement mixed with skepticism. This sounds almost too good to be true. What's the catch? Victoria laughed, a warm sound that made Margaret like her even more. No catch, just a person with means who believes that healthcare should be about caring for people, not maximizing profits. They talked for another hour, with Victoria asking detailed questions about Margaret's experiences with both doctors, what she had valued about Dr. Peterson's approach, and what changes she would like to see if the clinic were to be sold to new ownership. As they prepared to leave, Victoria handed Margaret an elegant business card. I'll be in touch soon. The purchase process is moving quickly. Dr. Mitchell is more motivated to sell than he initially appeared. Why is that? Margaret asked. Victoria's smile turned slightly mischievous. Let's just say that when you cut corners in healthcare, eventually, those corners have a way of cutting back. That evening, Margaret called her daughter Sarah, who finally answered on the third ring. Mom, I'm so sorry I missed your call the other day. I was in meetings all day. How are you feeling? Margaret filled Sarah in on her doctor visits and the strange encounter with Victoria Walsh. Sarah, who worked in corporate law, listened with growing interest. Mom, this sounds like someone is planning a hostile takeover of the clinic. The fact that they're doing such thorough patient interviews suggests they're building a case for poor management. But Victoria seemed genuinely interested in improving patient care, Margaret protested. That doesn't mean it's not a business decision, Sarah said, though honestly, from what you've told me about Dr. Mitchell, it sounds like patients would benefit from new ownership regardless of the motivation. After hanging up with Sarah, Margaret found herself thinking about Dr. Peterson. She still had his personal phone number, and on impulse, she decided to call him. Margaret! Dr. Peterson's familiar voice brought tears to her eyes. How wonderful. To hear from you. How have you been? She told him about her recent back problems and her experiences with Dr. Mitchell, though she kept the details about Victoria Walsh to herself. I'm so sorry to hear about your pain, my dear, Dr. Peterson said, and I'm afraid I'm not entirely surprised by your experience with Dr. Mitchell. I had hoped he would grow into the role. Dr. Peterson, may I ask you something personal? Of course. Were you forced to sell the practice? I heard rumors. There was a long pause. Margaret, you know I never like to burden my patients with my personal problems. But yes, I made some poor investment decisions and found myself in financial difficulty. Dr. Mitchell offered to buy the practice quickly, which I needed at the time. I'm so sorry. I wish I had known. Maybe the patients could have helped somehow. Dr. Peterson's voice was warm with affection. That's exactly why I didn't tell anyone. Patients like you had given me 40 years of trust and friendship. I wasn't about to burden you with my mistakes. After they said goodbye, Margaret sat in her living room, looking at the framed photographs that covered every surface, memories of a life well lived, of family gatherings and community events, of the countless small moments that had made up her 78 years. She thought about Dr. Peterson, who had cared for her family with such dedication that he'd been willing to sacrifice his own financial security rather than compromise patient care. She thought about Dr. Mitchell, so focused on profits that he couldn't see the human cost of his indifference. And she thought about Victoria Walsh's mysterious client, whoever they might be. Margaret had always been a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy. But as she prepared for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something significant, not just for her own medical care, but for the entire community that depended on Westfield Medical Clinic. Tomorrow, she decided she would do something she hadn't done in years. She would drive to the library and do some research. If changes were coming to her health care, she wanted to understand exactly what those changes might mean. What Margaret didn't know was that her research would uncover connections and revelations that would turn her quiet retirement upside down and place her at the center of a story that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in Westfield. Margaret had always been methodical in her approach to problems, a trait that had served her well during her 30-year career as a high school librarian. The next morning, she drove to the Westfield Public Library, where she still knew several staff members from her professional days. "Mrs. Thompson," exclaimed Jennifer Collins, the head librarian, "how lovely to see you. What brings you in today?" "I need to do some research," Margaret replied. "I'm trying to learn more about business transactions, specifically medical practice, sales, and acquisitions." Jennifer's eyes lit up with interest. Despite being only 35, she had always enjoyed Margaret's visits and respected her research skills. "That's quite specific. Is this for a personal project?" Margaret explained, in general terms, about the situation at the clinic and her desire to understand what might be happening behind the scenes. Jennifer was immediately intrigued and offered to help. They spent the next 3 hours diving into public records, business databases, and local newspaper archives. What they discovered painted a troubling picture of Dr. Mitchell's management of Westfield Medical. "Look at this, Jennifer said, pointing to her computer screen. Dr. Mitchell took out a significant loan to purchase the practice, using the clinic's assets as collateral. But according to these financial filings, the practice's revenue has actually declined over the past 2 years. Margaret leaned in to read the screen. "How is that possible? The town's population has grown." "That's what makes this interesting," Jennifer replied, pulling up more documents. "It looks like patient retention has dropped significantly. People are driving to other towns for medical care." They found several troubling details: complaints filed with the state medical board about rushed appointments and missed diagnoses, 3 former nurses who had left the practice citing ethical concerns, and a pattern of insurance claim disputes. That suggested the clinic was prioritizing procedures that generated higher reimbursements. "Margaret," Jennifer said quietly, "I think your Dr. Mitchell might be in serious financial trouble." Margaret felt a mix of satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed and worry about what this might mean for the community's health care. "Jennifer, I need to ask you to keep this research confidential for now." "Of course. But Margaret, if someone is planning to buy the clinic, this information suggests they could probably get it for much less than Dr. Mitchell originally paid." That afternoon, Margaret received another call from Victoria Walsh. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling again so soon. My client would very much like to meet with you." Margaret's heart began to race. "Meet with me? Why?" "They've been impressed by your insights about the clinic and your obvious care for the community's well-being. They're hoping you might consider taking on a more active role in the clinic's future." "I'm not sure I understand." Victoria's voice carried a smile. "Would you be available to meet tomorrow evening, say 7 o'clock at the Westfield Inn? My client will explain everything." Margaret agreed, though she spent the rest of the day alternating between excitement and anxiety. What could this mysterious person possibly want with a retired librarian? The next evening, Margaret arrived at the Westfield Inn 5 minutes early, wearing her best dress and carrying a small purse. The inn's restaurant was quiet, with only a few tables occupied. Victoria Walsh rose from a corner booth and waved her over. "Margaret, thank you so much for coming. I'd like you to meet my client." As Margaret approached the table, a figure in the shadowy corner booth rose to greet her. When they stepped into the light, Margaret gasped in recognition. "Hello, Margaret," said Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I believe you know my father." Margaret stared in shock. Dr. Peterson had mentioned his daughter many times over the years. Elizabeth had followed in her father's footsteps and become a physician, but she had specialized in emergency medicine and worked in major metropolitan hospitals. Margaret remembered her as a serious young woman who had occasionally helped in her father's office during high school summers. "Elizabeth? But I thought..." Victoria said her client wanted to remain anonymous. Elizabeth laughed, and Margaret could hear echoes of her father's warm chuckle. I needed to understand the situation fully before revealing myself. Please sit down. I have so much to explain. Over dinner, Elizabeth told Margaret her story. After completing her residency, she had worked in emergency rooms in Chicago, Denver, and finally Seattle. She had been successful, well-paid, and utterly miserable. I kept thinking about Dad and the way he practiced medicine, Elizabeth said. Every patient was a person with a story, not just a set of symptoms to treat quickly and move on. In the ER, that personal connection is nearly impossible, but I realized I was missing it desperately. 2 years ago, Elizabeth had learned about her father's financial troubles, not from him, but from a former colleague who had heard rumors. By then it was too late to help with the sale to Dr. Mitchell. But Elizabeth had begun planning her return to Westfield. I've been working as a locum tenens, a temporary physician filling in at various rural clinics, while I saved money and waited for the right opportunity, she explained. When I heard that Dr. Mitchell was struggling financially, I knew this might be my chance to come home and restore what Dad had built. Margaret listened in amazement as Elizabeth outlined her plans. She had enough savings to purchase the clinic outright and planned to expand services, hire additional staff, and return to the model of care that had made Westfield Medical special. But I don't want to just replicate Dad's practice, Elizabeth continued. I want to improve on it. That's where you come in. Me? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. I want you to be our patient advocate coordinator, Elizabeth said. You understand what patients need because you've been one. You know this community intimately. And you have the respect of people who have been patients here for decades. Margaret felt overwhelmed. But I'm 78 years old. I don't know anything about running a medical practice. Victoria Walsh leaned forward. Margaret, you know, more than you think. Your feedback about the changes under Dr. Mitchell was more valuable than any management consultant's report. Patients trust you, and trust is the foundation of good health care. Elizabeth nodded enthusiastically. The position would involve meeting with patients who have concerns, helping to design our policies around patient needs rather than just efficiency, and serving as a bridge between the medical staff and the community. You'd work part-time, set your own schedule, and have the authority to make real changes. Margaret's mind was reeling. Yesterday she had been a patient dismissed and ignored. Today she was being offered a role in transforming the very clinic that had treated her so poorly. When would this all happen? She asked. Elizabeth's smile widened. Dr. Mitchell has agreed to sell. We close on the purchase next Friday. If you accept our offer, you could start the following Monday. Margaret thought about Dr. Peterson and how proud he would be to see his daughter returning to continue his work. She thought about all the patients who had been dismissed or rushed through appointments. She thought about the community that deserved better health care. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Yes, I'll do it. Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. Welcome to the new Westfield Medical Clinic, Margaret. I have a feeling Dad would be very pleased. As Margaret drove home that night, she realized that her terrible experience with Dr. Mitchell's indifference had led to something she never could have imagined. Sometimes, she thought, the universe has a peculiar sense of justice. What she didn't yet know was that Dr. Mitchell's reaction to losing his practice would create one final challenge that would test everyone's resolve and bring the community together in ways no one had anticipated. Word traveled fast in a town like Westfield. By the time Margaret woke up the morning after her dinner with Elizabeth Peterson, her phone was already ringing. The first call was from her daughter Sarah. Mom, please tell me you didn't actually accept a job. Sarah's voice carried a mix of concern and disbelief. Margaret settled into her kitchen chair with her morning coffee. I did indeed. And before you start listing all the reasons why it's a terrible idea, let me explain. She spent 20 minutes telling Sarah about Elizabeth Peterson, the plans. for the clinic and her role as patient advocate coordinator. Sarah listened without interruption, which Margaret knew meant she was processing the information carefully. "Mom," Sarah finally said, "I have to admit, this Elizabeth Peterson sounds impressive. I looked her up online after you mentioned her yesterday. She's published research papers, worked at some of the best hospitals in the country, and has an impeccable reputation." "But," Margaret prompted, hearing the hesitation in her daughter's voice, "but you've never worked in healthcare administration. You're going to be dealing with insurance companies, medical regulations, and staff management. Are you sure you're up for that at your age?" Margaret felt a familiar surge of determination. "Sarah, I spent 30 years managing a library system, dealing with school board politics and mediating between teachers, students, and parents. I think I can handle being an advocate for patients." The second call came from her neighbor, Helen Martinez, who had heard rumors from someone at the grocery store. "Margaret, is it true that you're going to be working at the clinic and that Dr. Peterson's daughter is taking over?" Margaret confirmed the rumors, and within an hour, her phone was ringing constantly. The news was spreading through Westfield's informal communication network with remarkable speed. Former patients of Dr. Peterson were excited about Elizabeth's return, while current patients of Dr. Mitchell were eager to hear about changes in the practice. By afternoon, Margaret decided she needed to escape the phone calls and took a drive through town. She was surprised to see clusters of people gathered outside the clinic, some holding signs that read, "Welcome back, Dr. Peterson," and "Thank you for caring about patients." Dr. Mitchell's BMW was nowhere to be seen in the parking lot. That evening, Elizabeth Peterson called Margaret directly. "I hope you don't mind me calling you at home," Elizabeth said. "I wanted to give you a heads up about what's been happening at the clinic today." "I saw the crowd," Margaret replied. "It was quite a sight. Dr. Mitchell apparently didn't expect word to get out so quickly about the sale. He left the clinic this afternoon and hasn't returned. His staff is confused, and there are patients with scheduled appointments who don't know what's happening." Margaret could hear the concern in Elizabeth's voice. "What can I do to help? Would you be willing to start earlier than we discussed? I know we said next Monday, but I'm wondering if you could come in tomorrow to help reassure patients and assist with the transition." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Of course. What time should I be there?" The next morning, Margaret arrived at the clinic at 8 o'clock to find a small crowd already gathered outside. Victoria Walsh met her at the front door. "Thank God you're here," Victoria said. "Brittany called in sick, and the other staff members are overwhelmed with questions they can't answer." Inside, Margaret found chaos. Patients were clustered around the reception desk, some demanding to know if their appointments were still valid, others asking when Dr. Elizabeth Peterson would be seeing patients. The remaining staff, 2 nurses and a medical assistant, looked frazzled and uncertain. Margaret took charge with the natural authority she had developed during her years as a librarian, dealing with crisis situations. "Good morning, everyone," she said in a clear, carrying voice. "I know there are many questions about the changes happening here. Let me explain what I know." She gathered the patients into the waiting area and spent the next hour explaining the situation. Elizabeth Peterson was indeed purchasing the practice and would be taking over patient care. All existing appointments would be honored, and no patient would be abandoned during the transition. "But when will we actually see Dr. Peterson?" asked Mrs. Williams, an elderly woman who had been Dr. Peterson Sr.'s patient for decades. "Dr. Elizabeth Peterson will begin seeing patients on Monday," Margaret replied. "In the meantime, if anyone has urgent medical needs, we're working to arrange coverage." As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. Dr. Mitchell was leaning against his BMW, watching the clinic with an expression of barely controlled anger. She approached him cautiously. "Dr. Mitchell, is everything all right?" He turned to face her, and Margaret was startled by the change in his appearance. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes had the slightly wild look of someone under extreme stress. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice tight with emotion, I suppose you're pleased with how this has turned out. I'm pleased that the community will have quality health care again, Margaret replied carefully. Quality health care? Dr. Mitchell's voice rose. I provided excellent medical care. I ran this practice efficiently and profitably. Do you have any idea what it takes to keep a medical practice viable in today's healthcare environment? Margaret could see several people in the parking lot turning to watch their conversation. Dr. Mitchell, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Privately? He laughed bitterly. There's nothing private about what's happening here. That Peterson woman has been plotting this takeover for months, using patients like you to build a case against me. Margaret felt her patience beginning to wear thin. Dr. Mitchell, no one plotted anything. Your patient simply wanted to be treated with respect and receive quality care. Quality care? His voice was becoming louder, drawing more attention. I provided the same level of medical care as any physician in this region, but I also had to deal with insurance companies, regulatory compliance, staff management, and financial pressures that old Peterson never faced. Margaret noticed Victoria Walsh approaching from the clinic entrance, clearly concerned about the escalating confrontation. Dr. Mitchell, Margaret said firmly, I understand that this transition is difficult for you, but taking your frustration out on former patients isn't going to help anyone. He stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw something in his expression that looked almost like desperation. Then his face hardened again. You think you've won something here, don't you? An old woman playing healthcare administrator. Let me tell you something, Mrs. Thompson. Running a medical practice is more complicated than checking out library books. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. With that, he got into his BMW and drove away, leaving Margaret standing in the parking lot with her heart racing. Victoria Walsh reached her side, just as the car disappeared around the corner. Are you all right? Victoria asked, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. I'm fine, Margaret replied, though her hands were shaking slightly. But I think Dr. Mitchell is more troubled by this change than we realized. Elizabeth is on her way over, Victoria said. She wanted to meet with the staff and start planning for Monday's opening. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Elizabeth arrived at noon, bringing with her a calmness and competence that immediately settled the nervous staff. She spent time with each employee, assuring them that their jobs were secure and asking for their input on how to improve patient care. Margaret watched Elizabeth work with growing admiration. Unlike Dr. Mitchell, who had always seemed rushed and distracted, Elizabeth gave each person her full attention. She listened carefully to the nurse's suggestions, asked thoughtful questions about current procedures, and took detailed notes about everything from appointment scheduling to patient follow-up protocols. Margaret, Elizabeth said during a brief break, I'd like your input on something. I'm thinking about extending our hours to include some evening appointments. Many working people can't take time off during regular business hours for routine care. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. That's an excellent idea. I know several people who've had to go to urgent care centers for non-urgent issues simply because they couldn't get time off work. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself naturally falling into her new role. When patients called with questions about the transition, she answered with patience and warmth. When a confused elderly man arrived for an appointment he thought was scheduled, she helped reschedule him while ensuring he felt cared for rather than inconvenienced. By 5 o'clock, the clinic felt like a different place. The staff was smiling again, the phones were ringing with patients eager to schedule appointments with Elizabeth, and there was a sense of optimism that had been missing for months. Elizabeth gathered everyone in the main conference room for a brief meeting before closing. I want to thank all of you for your patience during this transition, she began. I know change can be stressful, but I'm excited about what we can accomplish together. She outlined her vision for the practice: longer appointment times, same day, sick visits, expanded preventive care services, and a focus on building long-term relationships with patients and their families. Margaret, Elizabeth continued, would you mind staying for a few minutes? I'd like to discuss your schedule and responsibilities in more detail." After the others had left, Elizabeth and Margaret sat in the quiet conference room as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. "How do you feel about your first day?" Elizabeth asked. Margaret considered the question. "Challenging, but in a good way. I feel like I made a difference today, even in small ways." "You made a huge difference. The staff told me how you handled the confusion this morning, and I saw how you dealt with that difficult conversation with Dr. Mitchell. You have exactly the kind of steady presence this place needs." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. It had been years since she felt this sense of purpose and usefulness. "Elizabeth," she said, "I have to ask, aren't you worried about taking on a practice that's been struggling financially?" Elizabeth smiled. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous about the business side of things. But I have good financial backing, and I've learned a lot about practice management during my locum work. More importantly, I believe that if you focus on providing excellent patient care, the financial success will follow." As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on the dramatic change her life had taken in just a few days. A week ago, she had been a dismissed patient in pain. Tonight, she was an integral part of a healthcare practice with a promising future. But Dr. Mitchell's angry words echoed in her mind. Was she really prepared for the challenges ahead? Did she truly understand what she had gotten herself into? She decided that tomorrow she would find out, and whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Margaret arrived at the clinic on Monday morning at 7:30, a full hour before the scheduled opening time. She wanted to ensure everything was perfect for Elizabeth's first day as the official owner and primary physician of Westfield Medical Clinic. She was surprised to find Elizabeth's car already in the parking lot, along with several others she didn't recognize. Inside, she discovered a flurry of activity that reminded her of the behind-the-scenes preparations for major library events she had organized over the years. "Margaret," Elizabeth called from behind the reception desk, where she was working with a woman Margaret didn't recognize. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen, our new practice manager." Sarah Chen appeared to be in her early 40s with short black hair and an efficient manner that reminded Margaret of the best administrators she had worked with. She greeted Margaret with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Elizabeth has told me so much about you," Sarah said. "I'm looking forward to working together. I think your patient advocate position is going to be crucial to our success." Margaret learned that Sarah had previously managed a family practice in Seattle and had been recruited by Elizabeth specifically for the Westfield Clinic over coffee. In the break room, Sarah explained her philosophy of healthcare administration. "Too many practices focus on maximizing the number of patients seen per day," she said, "but that approach often sacrifices quality of care and patient satisfaction. Elizabeth and I believe in a different model, one that prioritizes thoroughness, personal attention, and preventive care." The morning flew by as Margaret familiarized herself with her new office, a small but comfortable space adjacent to the main waiting area where patients could speak with her privately about concerns or complaints. Elizabeth had equipped it with comfortable seating, a coffee station, and large windows that looked out on the garden Dr. Peterson Sr. had planted years ago. At exactly 9 o'clock, Elizabeth unlocked the front doors to find a line of patients waiting outside. Margaret recognized many of them as longtime patients of Dr. Peterson Sr., but there were also several new faces, people who had heard about the change in ownership and were hoping to establish care with the new practice. The first patient was Mrs. Henderson, an 85-year-old woman who had been one of Dr. Peterson Sr.'s original patients 40 years ago. "Is it really true?" she asked Margaret as she checked in. "Is little Elizabeth really taking over her father's practice?" "It's true," Margaret assured her, "and she's not so little anymore. She's an accomplished physician who's very excited to be back in Westfield." Margaret watched through the open door as Elizabeth greeted Mrs. Henderson in the examination room. The resemblance to her father was striking. not just in appearance, but in the way she listened intently, made eye contact, and spoke with genuine warmth and concern. Throughout the morning, Margaret found herself serving as an unofficial ambassador for the new practice. Patients who were nervous about the change in physicians sought her out for reassurance. She explained Elizabeth's background, answered questions about appointment scheduling, and helped several people understand their insurance benefits, a service that had been notably absent under Dr. Mitchell's management. Around noon, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Brittany, the former receptionist who had been so dismissive during Margaret's original visit, appeared at her office door looking nervous and contrite. "Mrs. Thompson, I was wondering if I could talk to you for a minute." Margaret gestured for her to sit down. "Of course, Brittany. What can I do for you?" "I heard that Dr. Peterson is hiring new staff, and I wanted to apologize for how I treated you that day when you came in with back pain." Brittany's voice was shaky, and Margaret could see that the apology was genuine. "I was having a terrible day, and Dr. Mitchell had been pressuring all of us to limit walk-in appointments, but that's no excuse for being rude to you." Margaret studied the young woman's face. She could see genuine remorse, along with what looked like financial desperation. "Brittany, I appreciate your apology. That takes courage, but I have to ask, are you apologizing because you want your job back or because you genuinely feel bad about how you treated patients?" Brittany's eyes filled with tears. "Both, I guess. I do need the job. I've got 2 kids, and my husband was laid off last month. But I also felt terrible about that day. My grandmother always taught me to treat older people with respect, and I failed her and failed you." Margaret felt her heart soften. She had always believed in second chances, and she could see that Brittany's experience under Dr. Mitchell's management had been difficult for the staff as well as the patients. "I can't make any promises," Margaret said, "but I'll speak with Dr. Peterson and Sarah Chen. If they're willing to consider rehiring you, would you be willing to attend some customer service training?" Brittany nodded eagerly. "I'll do whatever it takes. I promise I'll be different." That afternoon, Margaret brought Brittany's request to Elizabeth and Sarah. To her surprise, both women were immediately interested. "One of the things I learned in my other positions," Sarah explained, "is that sometimes the best employees are people who've made mistakes and learned from them. They tend to be more empathetic and more committed to doing things right." Elizabeth agreed. "Besides, Brittany knows our patient base and our systems. If she's genuinely committed to changing her approach, it might be better than starting from scratch with someone new." They decided to offer Brittany a probationary position with mandatory training in patient relations and customer service. Margaret volunteered to serve as her mentor during the transition period. As the day wound down, Margaret reflected on how different the atmosphere in the clinic felt. Patients lingered in the waiting room, chatting with each other, and the staff than sitting tensely watching the clock. Elizabeth was running slightly behind schedule, but instead of rushing through appointments, she was taking the extra time needed to provide thorough care. At closing time, Elizabeth gathered the entire staff in the conference room for a debriefing of their first day. "How do you think it went?" she asked the group. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The nurses reported that patients seemed more relaxed and were asking more questions about their health, which they took as a sign that people felt comfortable and valued. Sarah noted that they had scheduled follow-up appointments for every patient who needed them, something that had been hit or miss under Dr. Mitchell's management. "Margaret," Elizabeth said, "I saw several patients seek you out today. How do you feel about the patient advocate role?" Margaret smiled. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. 3 patients brought concerns to me today that might have gone unaddressed otherwise. Mrs. Patterson was worried about the cost of a medication you prescribed, so I was able to connect her with a patient assistance program. Mr. Johnson had questions about his upcoming surgery that he was too embarrassed to ask you directly. And Mrs. Lopez needed help understanding her insurance coverage." Elizabeth nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. You're creating a space for patients to get help with things that fall outside the direct medical consultation, but are crucial to their overall experience. As Margaret prepared to leave, Elizabeth stopped her at the door. "Margaret, I want you to know how grateful I am that you took this position. Today felt like the kind of practice my father always talked about, a place where patients feel cared for as whole people, not just collections of symptoms." Driving home, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She had gone from being a dismissed patient to playing a central role in transforming the very clinic that had initially failed her. But more than that, she felt a sense of purpose and energy that she hadn't experienced since retiring from the library. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. As she turned into her driveway, Margaret noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there that morning. It was too dark to see the driver clearly, but something about the vehicle's placement made her uneasy. She made a mental note to mention it to Elizabeth tomorrow. After Dr. Mitchell's angry confrontation in the parking lot, she wanted to be cautious about any unusual activity around the clinic or its staff. For now, though, she was content to savor the satisfaction of a successful first day in her new role. Change, she reflected, could be frightening and challenging, but it could also be the beginning of something wonderful. 3 weeks into her new position, Margaret was settling into a routine that brought her more satisfaction than she had felt in years. She arrived at the clinic each morning at 8:30, reviewed the day's schedule with Sarah Chen, and spent her time moving between her office and the waiting areas, making herself available to patients who needed assistance or simply wanted someone to listen to their concerns. The transformation of Westfield Medical had been remarkable. Appointment times had been extended from 15 minutes to 30 minutes, allowing Elizabeth to provide thorough examinations and spend time answering questions. The staff had grown from the original skeleton crew to include 2 additional nurses, a part-time physician assistant, and Brittany, who had returned as receptionist with a completely transformed attitude toward patient service. But success brought new challenges. Margaret was in her office reviewing patient feedback surveys when Sarah knocked on her door with a concerned expression. "Margaret, we need to talk. I just got off the phone with our insurance processing company, and there's a problem." Margaret gestured for Sarah to sit down. Over the past few weeks, she had learned to read Sarah's expressions, and this one suggested serious trouble. What kind of problem? Dr. Mitchell apparently submitted a batch of insurance claims just before he sold the practice, claims for services that were never actually provided. The insurance companies are now demanding documentation that doesn't exist. Margaret felt her stomach drop. How much money are we talking about? Potentially $60,000 that we might have to pay back, plus penalties and interest. But that's not the worst part. What's the worst part? Sarah's expression grew even more grave. The state medical board has opened an investigation into fraudulent billing practices at the clinic. They're reviewing all claims submitted during Dr. Mitchell's tenure, and they want to interview staff members and patients. Margaret sat back in her chair, processing this information. "Does Elizabeth know?" "I just told her." "She's meeting with our attorney this afternoon. But Margaret, this could potentially shut down the clinic while the investigation is ongoing." The implications hit Margaret immediately. All the progress they had made, all the patients who were finally receiving quality care again, all the hope and energy that had been restored to the practice, it could all be destroyed by Dr. Mitchell's apparent fraud. What can we do? Elizabeth wants to cooperate fully with the investigation and provide complete documentation for every service we've billed since taking over. She's also planning to voluntarily return any questionable payments from the disputed claims, even though it wasn't her responsibility. Margaret admired Elizabeth's integrity, but she worried about the financial impact on the young practice. "Can the clinic afford to pay back $60,000? Sarah shook her head. "Not without serious difficulty. Elizabeth invested most of her savings in purchasing and upgrading the practice. A hit like this could force us to close. That afternoon, Margaret watched Elizabeth meet with a steady stream of lawyers, accountants, and insurance representatives. The stress was clearly taking its toll. Elizabeth's usual calm demeanor was replaced by tight smiles and frequent checking of her phone. Around 4 o'clock, Margaret was surprised to see a familiar figure enter the clinic. Dr. Peterson Sr., looking older and more frail than when she had last seen him, approached the reception desk where Brittany greeted him warmly. "Dr. Peterson, how wonderful to see you. Elizabeth didn't mention you were coming by." "I don't think she knows," he replied quietly. "I heard about the investigation, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help." Margaret approached them from her office. "Dr. Peterson, what a pleasant surprise, though I suspect this isn't entirely a social visit." He smiled ruefully. "You always were perceptive, Margaret. I suppose you've heard about the insurance fraud investigation." Margaret nodded, and Dr. Peterson's expression grew troubled. "I feel responsible for this mess. If I hadn't been forced to sell to Mitchell in the first place, none of this would have happened. Now Elizabeth's dream of restoring this practice could be destroyed by his dishonesty." "Dr. Peterson," Margaret said gently, "you couldn't have known what Dr. Mitchell would do after you sold. You made the best decision you could with the information you had." "Perhaps. But I can't just stand by and watch Elizabeth suffer for my mistakes. I've been thinking about this situation, and I may have an idea." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Elizabeth emerged from the conference room looking exhausted. Her face lit up when she saw her father. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I came to see if I could help with this insurance situation," he replied, embracing his daughter. "I've been thinking about some things that might be relevant to the investigation." They moved into Elizabeth's office, and Margaret could see them through the glass partition, engaged in intense conversation. After about an hour, Dr. Peterson emerged looking more animated than Margaret had seen him in months. "Margaret," he said, approaching her desk, "I wonder if you might help me with something. Do you remember the name of that investigative reporter from the county newspaper? The one who wrote those articles about the hospital billing problems a few years ago?" Margaret searched her memory. "You mean Jennifer Walsh from the Westfield County Herald? That's the one. Do you happen to have her contact information?" Margaret found the number in her phone and watched with growing curiosity as Dr. Peterson made the call. "Ms. Walsh, this is Dr. Robert Peterson from Westfield Medical." "Yes, I'm retired now. I'm calling because I have information about health care. Fraud that I think would interest you." "No, not at my old practice. At several practices in the county. Would you be available to meet tomorrow?" After he hung up, Margaret couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "Dr. Peterson, what's going on?" He looked around to make sure they couldn't be overheard, then leaned closer to Margaret's desk. "Margaret, Dr. Mitchell wasn't operating alone. During my final months at the practice, I became suspicious about some billing irregularities, but I was so overwhelmed by my financial problems that I didn't investigate thoroughly. I think Mitchell was part of a larger fraud scheme involving multiple practices in the county." Margaret's eyes widened. "What kind of scheme?" "Inflated billing for services not provided, unnecessary tests and procedures, kickbacks from equipment suppliers, potentially millions of dollars over several years. If I'm right, and if we can prove it, Elizabeth's practice might be seen as a victim rather than a participant." The next day, Margaret watched as Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, spent 3 hours at the clinic interviewing Dr. Peterson, reviewing documents and taking detailed notes. She also spoke with several long-term patients who could attest to the changes in care quality and billing practices before and after Dr. Mitchell's tenure. "This is bigger than I initially thought," Jennifer told Margaret before leaving. "If Dr. Peterson's suspicions are correct, this could be one of the largest healthcare fraud cases in the county's history." 2 days later, the Herald's front page featured a headline that sent shockwaves through Westfield's medical community. Multi-practice healthcare fraud scheme under investigation. Local clinic may be victim rather than perpetrator. The article detailed Jennifer Walsh's investigation into what appeared to be a coordinated effort involving Dr. Mitchell and at least 3 other physicians to systematically defraud insurance companies. It painted Elizabeth Peterson and the New Westfield Medical as reformers working to restore ethical practices to a corrupted system. Margaret was in her office when Sarah burst through the door with tears of relief in her eyes. "Margaret, you're not going to believe this. The insurance companies just called. Based on the Herald article and the additional evidence Dr. Peterson provided, they're dropping their demand for repayment from our practice. They're going after Dr. Mitchell and his associates instead." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway moments later, looking stunned. "The state medical board just called. They're closing the investigation into our practice and focusing on the larger fraud scheme. We're cleared." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So the clinic is safe?" "The clinic is safe," Elizabeth confirmed, "thanks to Dad's courage in coming forward and your help in connecting us with the right reporter." As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on the twists and turns of the past month. Dr. Mitchell's attempts to destroy the practice through fraud had ultimately failed, brought down by the very community connections and ethical standards he had tried to undermine. But more than that, she realized that her role as patient advocate had expanded beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. She had become a bridge between the medical practice and the community, helping to protect both patients and providers from those who would exploit the healthcare system for personal gain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Margaret felt confident that together she and Elizabeth and their dedicated staff could handle whatever came their way. In the weeks following the exposure of Dr. Mitchell's fraud scheme, Westfield Medical Clinic experienced an unprecedented surge in new patients. Word had spread throughout the county about Elizabeth Peterson's commitment to ethical, patient-centered care, and people were driving from neighboring towns to establish care at the practice. Margaret found herself busier than she had been in years, but it was a good kind of busy. Her role as patient advocate had naturally evolved to include community outreach and patient education. She had organized support groups for seniors managing chronic conditions, coordinated with local pharmacies to ensure medication accessibility, and even started a monthly newsletter highlighting health topics relevant to the community. On a crisp October morning, Margaret was reviewing applications for their new patient assistance program when Brittany knocked on her office door. "Mrs. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. She says her name is Patricia Mitchell." Margaret's blood ran cold. Dr. Mitchell's wife. She had met her briefly at a few community events over the years. Patricia was a quiet, elegant woman who had always seemed somewhat overshadowed by her husband's aggressive personality. "Send her in, please," Margaret said, steeling herself for what might be a difficult conversation. Patricia Mitchell entered the office, looking nothing like the polished doctor's wife Margaret remembered. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore little makeup, and her clothes, while still nice, lacked the designer label ostentation Margaret associated with her. "Mrs. Thompson," Patricia said quietly, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this is awkward, given everything that's happened." Margaret gestured to the comfortable chair across from her desk. "Please sit down. Would you like some coffee or water?" Patricia accepted a cup of coffee with grateful hands that Margaret noticed were trembling slightly. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here?" Patricia began. "I'll admit I'm curious," Margaret replied gently. "How can I help you?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she finally looked up, Margaret was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "I want to apologize," she said. "Not just for James, for Dr. Mitchell, but for myself. I knew something wasn't right with his practice, But I chose to ignore it because I didn't want to face the consequences. Margaret leaned forward, her natural empathy overcoming any lingering anger she might have felt. Patricia, you don't owe me an apology. You weren't responsible for your husband's professional decisions. Wasn't I? Patricia's voice was bitter. I knew he was cutting appointment times to see more patients. I knew he was ordering unnecessary tests. I heard him on the phone with pharmaceutical representatives making deals that seemed questionable. But I liked the money, and I didn't want to rock the boat. She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue Margaret had quietly provided. When the FBI raided our house last month, I found out just how deep the fraud went. James had been stealing from insurance companies for years, not just at your clinic, but at 2 others he was involved with. The money I thought was from his successful practice was actually stolen from patients and taxpayers. Margaret felt a mix of sympathy and anger. Patricia, I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you, but why are you telling me this? Patricia straightened up, and Margaret could see a hint of the strength she suspected had always been there beneath the passive exterior. Because I want to make it right as much as I can. I've been meeting with the FBI and the State Attorney General's office, providing information about James's activities. I've also liquidated all of our assets, the house, the cars, the investment accounts, everything we bought with stolen money. Margaret's eyebrows rose. You've liquidated everything? Everything. I'm living in a small apartment now, working as a substitute teacher, but I have a check here for $67,000. The amount the investigators determined was stolen specifically from Westfield Medical's patients during James's tenure. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, placing it on Margaret's desk. Margaret stared at the envelope in amazement. Patricia, this is... I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I know it doesn't undo the harm James caused, but I hope it can help Dr. Peterson continue the good work she's doing here. Margaret carefully opened the envelope and saw a certified check made out to Westfield Medical Clinic. The memo line read, "Restitution for patient fraud." "Have you spoken with Elizabeth about this?" Margaret asked. Patricia shook her head. "I was hoping you might help me arrange that conversation. I know she has no reason to trust me or want to see me, but I felt it was important to do this in person." Margaret excused herself and walked to Elizabeth's office. Through the glass partition, she could see Elizabeth reviewing patient charts between appointments. She knocked gently and explained the situation. Elizabeth's initial reaction was skeptical. "She wants to give us money? Why would she do that?" "I think she genuinely wants to make amends," Margaret said. "And Elizabeth, this money could fund our patient assistance program for months. We could help people who can't afford their medications, provide free screenings for uninsured patients, maybe even expand our mental health services." Elizabeth considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right, ask her if she can come back after we close today. I'll meet with her then." That evening, Margaret sat in on the meeting between Elizabeth and Patricia Mitchell. It was initially tense, with Elizabeth clearly struggling to separate Patricia from her anger toward Dr. Mitchell. But as Patricia explained her situation and her desire to make restitution, Elizabeth's demeanor softened. "Mrs. Mitchell," Elizabeth said finally, "I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but I have to ask, what do you expect in return?" Patricia's answer surprised both women. "Nothing. I don't expect forgiveness or friendship or even understanding. I just want to sleep at night knowing that I did what I could to repair some of the damage." Elizabeth accepted the check and agreed to use it specifically for charitable care and community health programs. As Patricia prepared to leave, she turned back to both women. "There's one more thing," she said. "James is going to prison, probably for a long time, but I want you both to know that seeing what you've built here, the way you actually care about patients, it's shown me what healthcare should look like. I'm starting nursing school in the spring. I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." After Patricia left, Margaret and Elizabeth sat in the quiet clinic, processing what had just happened. "Well," Elizabeth said finally. That's not how I expected this day to end, Margaret chuckled. I've learned that working in healthcare means expecting the unexpected. But Elizabeth, this money could really make a difference for our patients. I know, I'm thinking we could start with expanded prescription assistance and maybe add some preventive care screenings for low-income families. What do you think? Margaret smiled. I think your father would be very proud of what you're building here. As they locked up the clinic that night, Margaret reflected on the strange turn of events. Dr. Mitchell's fraud had nearly destroyed the practice, but its exposure had ultimately made them stronger. Patricia Mitchell's courage in making restitution would allow them to help even more patients in need. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the most unexpected people surprise you with their capacity for growth and redemption. Tomorrow, she would start, planning how to use Patricia's gift to build something even better for the Westfield community. 6 months after Elizabeth Peterson's takeover of the clinic, Margaret could barely recognize the practice that had once dismissed her as just another complaining elderly patient. The waiting room buzzed with positive energy, children played quietly in a dedicated corner while their parents filled out intake forms, and the staff moved with the confidence of people who love their work. Margaret was reviewing the latest patient satisfaction surveys, an initiative she had suggested, to track their progress when her phone rang. Margaret, this is Dr. Amanda Richardson from River Valley Medical Center. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I've been hearing remarkable things about what you're doing at Westfield Medical. Margaret recognized the name. Dr. Richardson was the chief of family medicine at the region's largest hospital, about 30 miles away. Thank you, Dr. Richardson. How can I help you? I'd like to invite you to speak at our quarterly medical conference next month. We're focusing on patient-centered care, and your patient advocate model is exactly the kind of innovation we want. It'll highlight. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with pride. You want me to speak to doctors and administrators? Absolutely. What you've accomplished at Westfield is getting attention throughout the region. We have several practices that are struggling with patient satisfaction, and they want to learn from your success. After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a moment, amazed by how far she had come. From dismissed patient to regional healthcare advocate, it seemed impossible. Yet, here she was. Elizabeth knocked on her door, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret, do you have a minute? I just got off the phone with the State Medical Association, and I have some interesting news. Margaret gestured for Elizabeth to sit down. Good news, I hope? Very good news. They want to feature our practice in their next newsletter as a model for patient-centered care. They're particularly interested in your patient advocate position and how it's improved our outcomes. Elizabeth pulled out a folder containing several documents. Look at these statistics, Margaret. Since you started here, our patient satisfaction scores have increased by 40%. Our appointment no-show rate has dropped by 30%, and our patient retention rate is now over 95%. Margaret studied the numbers with amazement. These are remarkable improvements. They are, and it's largely because of the work you're doing. Patients trust us now in a way they never trusted Dr. Mitchell, and a lot of that trust comes from knowing they have an advocate here who will listen to their concerns. Elizabeth leaned forward, her excitement evident. Margaret, I've been thinking about expanding this model. What if we offered consulting services to other practices that want to implement patient advocacy programs? Margaret considered this idea. That could help a lot of patients beyond Westfield. But would you have time to manage that along with your regular practice? I've been thinking about that too. What if we hired another physician to help with patient care here, and you and I spent part of our time traveling to other practices as consultants? You could train patient advocates while I work with physicians on implementing patient-centered care protocols. The idea was both exciting and intimidating. Margaret had never imagined that her experience as a dismissed patient could lead to helping reshape healthcare delivery on a regional level. Before she could respond, Brittany appeared at the office door, looking flustered. "Dr. Peterson? Mrs. Thompson? I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some people here from the local TV news. They want to do a story about the clinic and something about a patient advocate program." Margaret and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Neither had contacted the media. They walked to the front office to find a television crew setting up equipment, while a well-dressed reporter spoke with Sarah Chen. Several patients in the waiting room were watching with curiosity and amusement. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Turner, approached them with a microphone. "Dr. Peterson, Mrs. Thompson, I'm Jessica Turner from Channel 12 News. We've been hearing amazing stories about the transformation of this clinic and the innovative patient advocate program. Would you be willing to do an on-camera interview?" Margaret felt her heart rate spike. "How did you hear about us?" Jessica smiled. "Actually, we got a tip from Patricia Mitchell. She told us about the restitution she made to your clinic and how impressed she was with the changes you've implemented. She thought your story deserved wider attention." Margaret was stunned. Patricia Mitchell, the woman whose husband had nearly destroyed the practice, had contacted the media to promote their success. Elizabeth stepped forward. "We'd be happy to speak with you, but we'd want to focus on how this model could help other patients and practices, not just our own success." The interview lasted about an hour, with Jessica asking thoughtful questions about the patient advocate role, the transformation of the clinic, and their plans for the future. Several patients volunteered to speak on camera about their positive experiences, including Mrs. Henderson, who had been Dr. Peterson Sr.'s patient for decades. "This place feels like family again," Mrs. Henderson told the camera. "When I come here, I know Mrs. Thompson will make sure all my questions are answered and that I understand my treatment. That kind of care is precious." After the news crew left, Margaret found herself both exhilarated and overwhelmed. The attention was flattering, but it also brought pressure to maintain and expand their success. That evening, Margaret was at home preparing dinner when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her son David's number from Boston. "Mom, I just saw you on the evening news. You were amazing." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "The story aired already?" It was the lead story on the healthcare segment. "They called you a healthcare hero and said your patient advocate model is being studied by practices across New England. Mom, I'm so proud of you." Over the next hour, Margaret received calls from both her children, 3 former library colleagues, and several neighbors who had seen the news story. Each caller expressed amazement at her transformation from retired librarian to healthcare innovator. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the clinic to find the parking lot fuller than usual and a line of people waiting outside. Brittany met her at the door with a handful of phone messages. "Mrs. Thompson, we've had over 50 calls this morning from people wanting to become patients, and at least a dozen from other medical practices asking about consulting services," Brittany reported, breathlessly. Inside, Margaret found Elizabeth in her office fielding calls from reporters, medical administrators, and physicians from across the region. The phone seemed to ring constantly. "Margaret," Elizabeth said during a brief break between calls, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about the future. This response is beyond anything I imagined." They spent the lunch hour discussing the opportunities and challenges that came with their sudden prominence. Elizabeth had received inquiries from practices in 4 different states about implementing patient advocate programs. The State Medical Association wanted them to present at their annual conference. A healthcare consulting firm had offered to partner with them to expand their model nationally. "It's exciting," Margaret admitted, "but also overwhelming. 6 months ago, I was just trying to get someone to take my back pain seriously. Now, people are calling me a healthcare innovator," Elizabeth laughed. "Sometimes the best innovations come from people who aren't constrained by conventional thinking. You saw what was wrong with healthcare from a patient's perspective, and you found ways to fix it." That afternoon brought another surprise visitor. Dr. Peterson Sr. arrived at the clinic carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the biggest smile Margaret had seen from him in years. "I saw the news story," he announced to the entire staff. "I couldn't be prouder of what you've all accomplished here." He embraced his daughter, then turned to Margaret. "Margaret, when I sold this practice to Dr. Mitchell, I thought I was watching the end of everything I had built. Instead, you and Elizabeth have created something even better, something that could transform healthcare far beyond Westfield." They gathered in the conference room for an impromptu celebration, with Dr. Peterson Sr. toasting the success of what he called the new generation of healthcare heroes. To Elizabeth for having the vision to return home and rebuild this practice with integrity, he said, raising his glass. To Sarah for proving that excellent administration and patient care go hand in hand. To our entire staff for embracing change and putting patients first. And to Margaret, he paused, his voice becoming emotional, Horus Bais Art Lesna, for showing us all that the most powerful healthcare advocates are those who have been patients themselves. As the celebration wound down, Margaret found herself standing in the main hallway, looking at the walls that now displayed thank you letters from patients, community awards, and photos from various clinic events. The transformation was visible everywhere, in the warm lighting, the comfortable furniture, the children's artwork displayed proudly alongside medical certificates. Elizabeth joined her in the hallway. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking about that day 6 months ago when I came here in pain and was turned away. I was so angry and frustrated, but I never imagined that experience would lead to all this. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dr. Mitchell had simply treated you with kindness that day?" Elizabeth asked. Margaret smiled. "I think about that sometimes. Maybe I would have gotten my back pain treated, and that would have been the end of it. The clinic might still be struggling, patients might still be dissatisfied, and Dr. Mitchell might still be committing fraud." She paused, looking around the bustling clinic where patients and staff interacted with mutual respect and genuine care. "Sometimes I think the universe has a strange sense of timing," she continued. "Maybe I needed to experience healthcare at its worst so I could help create healthcare at its best." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "My father always said that the most important moments in medicine aren't the dramatic saves or the complex procedures. They're the quiet moments when someone feels heard and cared for. You've helped us create more of those moments." As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to expand their model to help more patients. The consulting requests, the speaking engagements, the media attention, it all represented chances to spread the message that patients deserved better than rushed appointments and impersonal care. But more than any external recognition, Margaret treasured the daily moments of connection with patients who felt genuinely cared for. Each person who left the clinic feeling heard and respected was a victory for the kind of healthcare system she and Elizabeth were working to build. 6 months ago, she had been dismissed as just another elderly patient with complaints. Now she was helping to reshape how healthcare could and should work. It was, she thought as she drove home, the most meaningful work she had ever done. 1 year after Margaret Thompson first walked into Westfield Medical Clinic as a dismissed patient, she stood at the podium of the National Conference on Patient-Centered Care, looking out at an audience of over 500 healthcare professionals from across the country. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. The woman who couldn't get a doctor's appointment was now being asked to teach doctors how to better serve their patients. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "a year ago I was just another elderly patient whose pain was dismissed as unimportant. Today I want to share with you how that dismissal led to a transformation that has touched thousands of lives and proved that the best healthcare innovations often come from the patients themselves." The audience was attentive, as Margaret told. Her story from that first painful encounter with Dr. Mitchell through the exposure of his fraud, Elizabeth's return to Westfield, and the development of their patient advocate model. She spoke about the importance of seeing patients as whole people rather than collections of symptoms, and how small changes in approach could dramatically improve both patient satisfaction and health outcomes. The patient advocate role isn't just about resolving complaints, she explained. It's about creating a bridge between the clinical world and the human experience of illness. It's about ensuring that no patient ever leaves a healthcare facility feeling unheard or unimportant. During the question and answer session, a physician from Oregon asked, "Mrs. Thompson, what advice would you give to practices that want to implement a patient advocate program but are concerned about the cost?" Margaret smiled, remembering her own initial doubts about her qualifications. Start small and start with heart. You don't need expensive consultants or complex systems. You need someone who genuinely cares about patients and has the authority to make changes. In many cases, that person might already be working in your practice, a nurse, a receptionist, or even a volunteer from your community. After her presentation, Margaret was surrounded by healthcare professionals wanting to know more about their model. She exchanged contact information with dozens of physicians, administrators, and nurses who were eager to bring patient advocacy programs to their own communities. Elizabeth, who had attended the conference to support Margaret and present their clinical outcomes data, found her in the lobby afterward. "How do you feel?" Elizabeth asked, beaming with pride. "Amazed," Margaret replied honestly. "A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be speaking to doctors about improving patient care, I would have thought they were crazy." Elizabeth laughed. "Well, get used to it. We have speaking engagements booked for the next 6 months, and our consulting waiting list is 3 months long." The success of their model had indeed exceeded everyone's expectations. Westfield Medical Clinic now served as a training site for patient advocates from across the region. Their patient satisfaction scores consistently ranked in the top percentile nationally, and their financial performance had improved dramatically as word-of-mouth referrals brought in new patients from throughout the county. More importantly, they had helped launch patient advocate programs at over 30 practices in 12 states. Each program was adapted to the local community's needs, but all shared the core principle that patients deserved to have their voices heard and their concerns addressed with respect and compassion. The ripple effects extended beyond individual practices. The State Medical Association had incorporated patient advocacy training into their continuing education requirements. 2 medical schools had added patient advocacy components to their curricula, and the federal government was studying their model as part of a larger initiative to improve patient satisfaction in healthcare. As they flew back to Westfield the next day, Margaret found herself thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by their work. There was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow, who had been afraid to ask questions about her medications until Margaret helped her understand that her concerns were valid and important. There was young Tommy Rodriguez, whose mother had been too intimidated by the healthcare system to seek treatment for his recurring ear infections, until Margaret walked her through the process and ensured she felt supported. There was Mr. Johnson, the retired factory worker who had been bouncing between specialists without anyone taking time to coordinate his care until Margaret stepped in to serve as his advocate and liaison. Each success story reinforced Margaret's belief that healthcare worked best when patients felt valued and heard. Back in Westfield, Margaret was greeted by a celebration that the entire clinic staff had organized in her honor. The conference room was decorated with banners reading, "Welcome home, Healthcare Hero," and the table was laden with a cake shaped like a stethoscope. Speech! Speech! called out Brittany, who had become one of Margaret's most enthusiastic supporters and had herself enrolled in a healthcare administration program. Margaret stood at the head of the table, looking at the faces of the people who had become more than colleagues. They had become a family united by their commitment to excellent patient care. "When I first took this job," she began, "I thought I was just going to help a few patients navigate the healthcare system. I never imagined we would be part of a movement to transform healthcare across the country." She paused, feeling emotional, as she continued, "But the most rewarding part of this journey hasn't been the recognition or the speaking engagements. It's been the daily privilege of working with all of you to create a place where patients feel genuinely cared for." Sarah Chen raised her glass. "To Margaret, who proved that the best healthcare advocates are those who have been patients themselves." As the celebration continued around her, Margaret stepped outside to the small garden that Dr. Peterson Sr. had planted decades earlier. The flowers were in full bloom, and she could see patients through the windows, sitting comfortably in the waiting room, chatting with staff, and looking relaxed rather than anxious. Elizabeth joined her in the garden. "Penny for your thoughts?" Margaret smiled. "I was just thinking about how this all started with something as simple as back pain and a dismissive doctor. It seems impossible that such a negative experience could lead to something so positive." "Maybe that's the lesson," Elizabeth suggested. "Sometimes our worst experiences teach us the most about what needs to change." Margaret nodded, then asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Elizabeth, what's next for us? We've accomplished more than we ever dreamed. Where do we go from here?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, looking out at the thriving clinic. "I think we keep growing, but carefully. We've proven that patient-centered care works both clinically and financially. Now we need to help other practices implement it sustainably." She turned to Margaret with excitement in her eyes. "I've been talking with some investors about creating a nonprofit foundation focused on patient advocacy training. We could develop standardized curricula, provide ongoing support to practices implementing our model, and fund patient advocate positions in underserved communities." The idea took Margaret's breath away. "A foundation? You mean we could help patients and practices nationwide?" "Exactly. And I can't think of anyone better suited to lead that effort than the woman who started this whole movement by refusing to accept substandard care." As they walked back into the clinic, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a retired librarian whose primary concerns were tending her garden and managing her arthritis. Today, she was at the center of a healthcare revolution that was improving care for thousands of patients. That evening, Margaret called her children to share the news about the potential foundation. Both Sarah and David expressed amazement at their mother's transformation and pride in her accomplishments. "Mom," Sarah said, "you've found your calling at 79. That's pretty incredible." "You know what's funny?" Margaret replied. "I spent 30 years as a librarian thinking that was my life's work. But maybe all those years of helping people find information and navigate complex systems was just preparation for this." As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret thought about Dr. Mitchell, who was now serving a federal prison sentence for healthcare fraud. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness that his choices had caused harm to so many patients. But his actions had inadvertently created the opportunity for something much better to emerge. She thought about Patricia Mitchell, who had completed her first semester of nursing school with honors and had written to thank Margaret for inspiring her to pursue a career in healthcare. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, redemption comes in unexpected forms. Most of all, she thought about all the patients she had helped over the past year, and all the patients who would benefit from the advocacy programs spreading across the country. Each person who received better care because they had someone to listen to their concerns and fight for their needs was a testament to the power of turning negative experiences into positive change. Margaret Thompson had come full circle, from dismissed patient to healthcare advocate to national healthcare reform leader. But the most important part of her story wasn't the recognition or the success. It was the simple truth that healthcare works best when patients are treated as valued human beings deserving of respect, compassion, and excellent care. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret smiled at the thought of tomorrow's possibilities. There were more practices to help, more advocates to train, and more patients to serve. At 79, she had found her life's most important work. And she was just getting started. The doctor who had ignored her pain had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would transform healthcare for thousands of people. In the end, Margaret Thompson had indeed gotten the last laugh, not through revenge, but through the creation of something beautiful, meaningful, and healing for everyone it touched. Sometimes justice comes not through punishment, but through transformation. And sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single person who refuses to accept that things have to stay the way they are. Margaret Thompson's story was proof that it's never too late to make a difference, and that the best advocates for change are often those who have experienced the problems firsthand. Her legacy would live on in every patient who felt heard, every practice that chose compassion over efficiency, and every healthcare provider who remembered that their most important job was simply to care. The clinic was quiet now, but tomorrow it would again be filled with patients who knew they would be treated with dignity and respect. And that, Margaret thought, was the most beautiful ending of all.